In our previous lesson, we learnt how the kings established their new kingdoms. We also learnt about the tripartite struggle that took place between the Gurjara Pratiharas, the Palas and the Rashtrakutas to gain control of Kannauj. Now with this, we understood that the kings now established their new kingdoms, their new dynasties, despite not belonging to royal families. These are the points that we have discussed in our previous lessons. Now, after these kings established their new kingdoms or their new dynasties, they had to make their presence strongly felt. They had to make people understand their power. They also had to assert their authority, their dominance on people, which is why they required to glorify themselves. They required to celebrate themselves and their rule. And for this reason, these new kings now took up the title of Maharaja Adhiraja, which means the great king of the overlords, or Tribhuvana Chakravartin, which means the king of the three worlds. From these high sounding titles in the likes of Maharaja Adhiraja or Tribhuvana Chakravartin, you can understand how these kings wanted to assert their power. They wanted to show people how powerful they were. They wanted to show people that they were very strong. So, after establishing their kingdoms and glorifying themselves as Maharaja Adhiraja or Tribhuvana Chakravartin, the kings now had to take care of the administration of their kingdoms or their dynasties. Now, a king's work is not restricted to founding or establishing a dynasty alone, because when a dynasty is established, it had to be properly administered. We live in a country called India, at the head of which sits the Prime Minister. Now, the Prime Minister alone cannot take care of all the affairs, of all the things that are happening in the country, which is why the Prime Minister appoints ministers or civil servants and bureaucrats to take care of the administration. Now, who did these new kings rely upon to take care of the administration of these dynasties? The new kings now relied upon the Samantas or subordinates, peasants, traders and Brahmanas for proper administration of their kingdoms. Now let us begin discussing how these people helped the king in the administration of the kingdoms. In the lesson that initiated us to the new kings and kingdoms, we learnt about the Samantas. The Samantas were subordinates to the kings, and the king had to rely upon the service provided by the Samantas or the subordinates for proper administration. Another very important group of people that the king required to heavily rely upon was the peasants. Now, how are the peasants important to a king? A king is very powerful. A king gets to assert his authority, his dominance, his power on his people. But why are peasants important to the king? This is because when a kingdom is established or a dynasty is established, a lot of people start staying in the kingdom. Now, in order to feed these people, agriculture needs to be pursued. Now, who pursues agriculture? Peasants and cultivators pursue agriculture. They produce food crops and cash crops that are required to feed the population in a kingdom or a dynasty. And it is for this reason that the peasants were heavily relied upon by the king. Next, we come to the traders. Now, how are traders important to a king? We have to understand that traders are that group of people who perform trade or business, and on account of performing trade or business, they bring revenue to the kingdom, and this revenue is required for the maintenance of a kingdom or a dynasty. So, traders are also very important when a kingdom has to maintain itself, when we look at the maintenance of a kingdom from an economic perspective. And last but not the least, we come to the Brahmins. Who were the Brahmanas? The Brahmins were learned men. These men indulged in scholarly activities. Now these learned men were instrumental in providing education and knowledge to the masses. So the Brahmins were required by the king to provide education and knowledge to the masses. So together the Samanta or subordinates, the peasants, the traders and the Brahmins helped the king in proper administration of their kingdoms. So by now you have understood how the king sat at the top of the kingdom and the Samanta, peasants, traders and Brahmanas came under him to help him in sustaining and maintaining the dynasty or kingdom. Now you must be wondering where resources came from. That is to say, how did the king procure resources for the maintenance of their kingdoms? Resources were obtained from producers like peasants, cattle keepers and artisans. Now, the peasants were very important because they were the people who grew crops, and crops were required to provide food to the masses. And at the same time, it is from these crops, that is from this production of crops, that the king obtained resources. Along with that, the cattle keepers also helped in the production of dairy products, and the artisans produced goods. So together, the peasants, cattle keepers and artisans helped in providing resources to the king. Now, these people, that is the peasants, cattle keepers and artisans, were often compelled to do something. That is to say, they were often meant to do something unwillingly. They were compelled to surrender a part of what they produced, and a part of what they produced was claimed as rent to their landlords. So in that lesson that initiated us to the new kings and kingdoms, we learnt about the landlords. That is, landlords were people who owned lands and rented it to other people. Now these landlords rented their lands to peasants for the production of crops. They also rented their lands to the cattle keepers for the grazing of animals. So in this way the landlords rented their lands, and what these people produced, that is the peasants, cattle keepers and artisans produced, was then claimed as rent by the landlords. So this is how the kings obtained their resources. Now let me ask you a question. Have you heard of the term GST or Goods and Services Tax? Yes, GST or Goods and Services Tax is an indirect tax that is levied on products that are sold or services that are sold. So this is a kind of a trade tax that is prevalent in our country. Now something similar was also prevalent in the medieval India. That is to say, the kings also used to extort money from people in a similar kind of way. Now, revenue was collected from traders. Traders as in people who perform trade or people who perform business. They buy and sell things amongst themselves. And these traders were compelled to pay revenue for the products they sold. Now, this is very similar to the GST that people performing business have to pay to the government in today's India. The traders who were performing trade during those times had to pay revenue on the products they sold, and this revenue now went to the king. We learnt that the king alone cannot do everything in the dynasty. That is to say, he alone cannot be in charge of every affair that happens in a dynasty. Now you must be wondering, who collected the revenues? People from influential families were appointed to collect revenues. Now this was also similar when it came to the case of the army. The army was also comprising people from influential families alone. So these people or close relatives of the king held these positions often hereditarily. That is to say, the king appointed his close relatives or people from influential families to collect revenue and join army. And this was also done hereditarily. And this also happened hereditarily, which means that after the death of a revenue collector, it was his son or his heir who now became the next revenue collector. So in this way, King's close relatives and people from influential families were the ones who collected the revenue. Now we have learned that the king was earning a lot of revenue in the form of taxes paid by the traders and revenue from the cultivators, peasants, cattle keepers and artisans. So this must together amount to a lot of money, a lot of resources. Now what did the king do with so much money, with so much resources? The kings then used these resources to finance their establishments, and they also used these resources for the purpose of construction. The kings constructed temples and forts with the resources or revenue they collected. Now why were the kings so keen on building temples and forts? This is because through these constructions the kings wanted to portray their power. They wanted to showcase how powerful and strong they were, how wealthy and affluent their kingdom was, which is why they were able to construct temples and forts. So the revenue that the kings collected were used to finance their establishments, that is, their establishments as in the places they lived in. And simultaneously with that, they also constructed a lot of temples and forts. Now the kings required resources for other purposes, as in purposes that were different from the construction of temples and forts. So what were these resources required for? Resources were required to fight wars. Why were wars important? And why do people wage war? People often wage war when they are lacking something that another person has. Now this was a prevalent thing not just in the medieval period, but this has continued for centuries. When one king or when one kingdom, when one dynasty has something and another king is eyeing it, that king will try to wage war against this king to take possession of those resources. And resources were also required to fight wars because a lot of money was required to maintain an army, to fight wars. So the king also spent their resources to fight wars. Now wars were also very crucial to the kings. Firstly, wars stressed the importance of a king. If a king goes on waging multiple wars and gaining victory in all times, that king will be able to establish his power, his authority. That king will be able to establish himself as a very powerful ruler, as a very powerful conqueror. So, for this reason, wars were very important to be waged by the kings. Simultaneously with that, wars also meant acquisition of wealth. This is a point we just discussed, that when a king is coveting the possession or wealth of another king and he wages a war and defeats that king, he acquires that wealth. So, for the purpose of acquisition of wealth, wars were very important to the kings. Also with that, wars gave them access to new land and trade routes. How is that possible? Because when a king is waging a war against another king, another kingdom, and manages to defeat that king, the king now gets access to that new land. Suppose this is land A and that is being ruled by King A, and this is land B that is being ruled by King B. Now King A wages war against King B and defeats King B. Now King A will be able to gain access to land B, and together King A will try to consolidate land A and land B, and this will broaden the size of his empire or his territory. So in this way he gets access to new lands just by fighting wars. And with that he also gets access to trade routes. Now different kingdoms had different trade routes that were strategically important to them. Now considering the instance of King A, land A, and King B, land B in this regard as well. Now when King A manages to defeat King B, he will get access to land B. And with the access to land B, he will also gain access to the trade routes in land B. And in this way, he will gain access to not just land B, but also the trade routes in land B. So you can understand how crucial wars were to the kings. They were able to acquire wealth, they also got access to new land and trade routes simultaneously with establishing their supremacy, their dominance over other kingdoms. And for these wars were required finances. So this one point that we have understood, or this one point that we can take away from this discussion, is that resources were very important to the kings, and these resources were produced, or these resources were obtained from peasants, cattle keepers, artisans and traders. Now we have understood that after establishing their kingdoms and dynasties, these kings were hungry for power. They were hungry for supremacy. They wanted to portray themselves as very able rulers, as very strong and powerful rulers who were very, very dominant. Now these kings in no way wanted to meet oblivion right after their death. And it is for this reason that they now wanted to get prashastis written. Now what are prashastis, and how did the kings ensure that they remain glorious in the pages of history as well? These prashastis are detailed accounts of how the rulers wanted themselves to be glorified. These rulers wanted to assert their dominance, their power. They wanted to show their supremacy. And on these prashastis, that is, in these detailed accounts, they glorified themselves. But who did this work for them? That is, who wrote this panegyric on the kings? The prashastis were written by learned men like Brahmanas. So it were the Brahmanas who were writing the prashastis, or detailed account on the kings, on how glorious these kings were. Now when these Brahmanas were writing the prashastis, the kings wanted to attribute adjectives in the likes of powerful, glorious, strong, courageous, victorious to them. And these Brahmanas were writing these in the prashastis. Now you must be wondering, why did the Brahmanas often resort to falsehood? As in, why did they choose to glorify the rulers even when they were not so? Because the Brahmanas were learned men and they were supposed to write prashastis. But when the kings were not very glorious themselves, the Brahmanas still portrayed those kings as very glorious in the pages of history. Why did this happen? This is because the Brahmanas were commissioned by the kings to write the prashastis. Commissioned means that the king used to pay the Brahmanas for writing those prashastis, or glorified accounts of the rule of those kings. So the Brahmanas were rewarded by the kings for writing the prashastis. Suppose a man does a job. He works from 9 to 5 every day, and at the end of the month he is given his salary. Now you can consider this writing of prashastis by the Brahmanas in similar light. The Brahmanas used to write these prashastis, which were celebratory accounts of the rulers, which were celebrating the rule of the kings. And for this work they were rewarded by the kings. So this was just a service that the Brahmanas paid to the kings. They were commissioned to write the prashastis. But how were the Brahmanas commissioned? As in, how were these Brahmanas rewarded by the kings? The Brahmanas were given land grants. That is, rewards were given to the Brahmanas in the form of land grants. Now, these land grants, or the rewards that were given to the Brahmanas, were then recorded on copper plates. Now, why were these recorded on copper plates? Now, let me give you an example so that these rewards on copper plates will be clear to you. Now, you go to rent a house and you start living there. After a couple of months, your landlord gives you an eviction notice. That is to say, he asks you to leave the house. Now you will be saying that you pay your rents regularly. You should not be compelled to leave your house. But is there a proof that you pay your rents regularly? For this, a proof of agreement is signed between a landlord and a tenant. So if you can show your landlord this proof of agreement that you pay your rent on time, your landlord will not be able to throw you out of that house. And in a similar way, the land grants that were given to the Brahmanas were recorded on copper plates. That is to say, the copper plates recorded that land grants were given to the Brahmanas. So these were a kind of a legal proof that this reward has been given to a Brahmana by the king. Now let me quickly ask you a question before proceeding with our lesson. The land grants which the Brahmanas received from the kings were recorded on silver plates. Will you be able to tell me if this sentence is true or false? Yes, you are right. This statement is false because the land grants that the Brahmanas received from the kings were recorded on copper plates and not silver plates. A Sanskrit Prashasti found in Gwalior, Madhya Pradesh eulogized the Pratihara king Nagabhata. He was celebrated for being able to bring to their knees the rulers of Andhra, Vidarbha, Saindhava and Kalinga. He was also celebrated for his victories against the king of Kanauj or Chakrayudha, the king of Vanga or Bengal, Anarta or a part of Gujarat, Malava or Madhya Pradesh, Kirata or the forest people, Turushka or the Turks, and Vatsa and Matsa, which were both kingdoms in North India. In this regard, another Prashasti that is very important was written by a man called Kalahana. What is this Prashasti known as? This Prashasti is known as Kalahana's Rajtarangini, or the Chronicle of the Kings of Kashmir. This was written in the 12th century. This Sanskrit poem, Kalahana's Rajtarangini, was written in the 12th century by Kalahana, and it talks about the rulers who were ruling Kashmir during that period. Now for this, Kalahana had relied upon inscriptions, written histories and documents to together understand about the rulers and how they ruled Kashmir. But Kalahana's Rajtarangini has been different from the other Prashastis in one regard. Why is it so? Because we have learnt that the former Prashastis that were commissioned by the kings always eulogized and celebrated the kings. The kings were always glorified in the Prashastis. Now in contrast to that, Kalahana did not choose to eulogize or glorify the kings of Kashmir. Instead, he criticized the rulers and their policies, which is why Kalahana's Rajtarangini is very important in the pages of history, because it gives a realistic depiction or a realistic account of the rule of the rulers of Kashmir. Now for this reason, Kalahana's Rajtarangini has been very important in history because it provides a realistic account of the rule of the various rulers of Kashmir. It did not, or rather he did not choose to glorify these rulers, and instead he criticized their policies. With this, we come to an end of our discussion on administration in the new kingdoms. We learnt how the kings heavily relied upon the services of the Samantas or the subordinates, the peasants, the traders and the Brahmanas for proper administration of their kingdoms. We also learnt how revenue was obtained and how this revenue or these resources were used by the kings. Along with that, we also talked about Prashastis, or the way in which the rulers wanted to keep themselves alive in the pages of history. And with this, we come to an end of our discussion on administration in the new kingdoms. But our discussion on the new kingdoms, that is the larger discussion that we have started, will not be complete without discussing one very important kingdom in the southern part of the country. So, it is the rule of that kingdom that we will be finding out in our subsequent lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.